Welcome. Welcome to the fourth in our series of speaking out against racism and hate in the church. Now, before I get to the words of our study today that's been provided by the Presbyterian Church in Canada, Justice Ministries, I would once again like to just remind us of the four agreements. Stay engaged, experience discomfort, speak your truth, and expect and accept non-closure. I really hope you're also taking an opportunity to continue to learn more and explore on your own, maybe discovering other things to read and to grow in your knowledge. And I acknowledge personally, and maybe for you as well, if you're watching today, that for many of us, this is an incredible privilege. For those of us who haven't been raised in or lived every single day of our lives with the results of systemic racism, but in fact have benefited, have been the beneficiaries of it, to learn and to read and to listen and to study is essentially the very definition of privilege. And that's why it's really important that we don't stall here. Action is needed, doing something, being a part of the change that this world needs to see happen must be the next step. And that being said, I'd encourage you to grow in your learning still. And specifically, I would really encourage that you seek out that Canadian kind of context, the conversation that's happening in our own country with regard to how we need to own and understand systemic racism and address it in Canada is vitally important. And to that end, I'm currently reading Robyn Maynard's book, Policing Black Lives. And the podcast that I recommended last time, Anti-Racist Educator Reads, who features at least our local host in Guelph, Colinda, Clyne, they're beginning to discuss that very book this month. And right now we're in August 2020 as I record this. So I'd encourage you to read the book and then maybe check out the podcast to enhance what you're reading, to hear others conversing about it and to get a better sense of what you might learn and what you might understand and take in and see what kind of actions you might put out into the world in your own context and in your own life. And I'll make sure to put all these recommendations in the description below. So for now, let's move on to our part 4, essentially the last part of our study guide. Next episode will essentially be some prayers and some opportunities for some spiritual grounding in the work that we're doing right now. Now, last time we looked at some really troubling statistics, and I'll put them on the screen again this time. In addition to these kinds of statistics, there's a deeply concerning rise of white supremacism, certainly south of our border, we've seen that, but also right here in Canada. For example, Barbara Perry, an expert on hate crimes and a professor in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, has noted that there are currently, at minimum, 130 active far-right extremist groups in Canada, which she points out is an increase of about 30% from 2015. And she adds that most of these groups are organized around ideologies against certain religions and races, with anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish sentiments being the most common, followed by a hatred of immigrants and Indigenous people, women, LGBTQ communities, and other minority groups. Now, these kinds of groups that participate in this white supremacy are often referred to as the alt-right. What they do is they actively recruit new members to their cause. And how they do this is, at least hearing from those who've left the movement, they explain that one of the primary ways in which they do this is a tactic that they use is to find people who look and seem respectable to be the face of recruitment or for interacting with the public. And these individuals then find people dealing with insecurity, including areas of job loss and relationship breakdowns. And they identify the types of fears that the person is experiencing, and then what they do is they exploit those fears, and they blame target minority groups, such as those listed in the statistics that we've already seen. And they blame them for the hardship and the pain or the anxiety of someone who is economically or relationally vulnerable that they're experiencing in this moment. And they offer them a purported solution to disempower or harm target groups in order to supposedly regain the power, the wealth, the security, or the sexual relationships that they should have instead by natural right. The effects of such messages are chillingly apparent in the statistics that we see, and certainly in other reports, such as the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Addressing and ending racism is further complicated by the fact that many of the communities targeted can be hesitant to speak to police, since there has been a significant history of racism in police forces in Canada as well. This history, which continues to manifest today, has taken the shape of racial profiling, overrepresentation of minorities being arrested, and harsher sentencing for minorities, and even police brutality and statistically increased likelihood of lethal force being used by police against minorities. And even right now, the Toronto Police Services has received a report that their board is considering in the coming month that speaks to these very statistics of the over-representation of Black persons in their engagement and interaction with police. The statistics show, the evidence is showing that this is just too much. And they're hoping to begin to address the systemic racism that may be involved in this. And the look at the numbers is certainly telling. Indigenous people only make up 4.8% of the population, and yet they're represented as 15% of the total fatalities of civilians shot by police in Canada. And members of the Black community, who only make up 3.4% of the Canadian population, represented 9% of the fatalities. So it seems that both racial groups are disproportionately affected by police violence relative to other ethnicities. So what this tells us is that racism is not only just a bad thing or something that needs to be addressed. Racism itself is deadly. And this is one of the reasons that Christians must speak out against it. You see, racism has normalized a belief that Black lives don't matter as much as white lives. It has normalized a belief that Indigenous lives don't matter as much as non-Indigenous lives. It has normalized a belief that people of color are and should be second class. As we can see in incidents such as the 2017 shootings at the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec, the 2018 shootings of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and the 2015 Charleston church shooting of Black parishioners, those beliefs that certain lives matter less than others has led to deadly mass assaults. And as we see even today with stories such as the death of George Floyd at the hands of police while people watched, that belief that some lives matter less takes individual lives as well. And to remind ourselves that this is not just a problem somewhere else or in other places, as we see with the numbers that show the statistics in Canada, that show that Indigenous and Black people in Canada are statistically significantly more likely to die in interactions with the police than any of their non-Indigenous or non-Black counterparts. So we must acknowledge that racism is deadly for individuals here in Canada too. Now we are all God's children, and we must speak up and stand up for and with each other. We must all work to end systemic and interpersonal racism. You see, racism disrupts the heart of society. It cuts through community relationships and alienates neighbor from neighbor. But even more than that, it speaks the message that some people are worth less than others. And so it matters less if bad things happen to them. That cannot be the witness of the Church of Jesus Christ. These trends of increased hate crimes and a rise in white supremacism in Canada are certainly troubling, but the Church is not powerless to address them. The Church could be a voice and a model of how racism must be rejected in favor of diverse, inclusive, and respectful communities. Much earlier in this study, We identified some doctrines and policies and practices individually that advocate for the superiority of one people over others. And now that we've come to the conclusion of the study, it'd be important to think back to some of those policies and doctrines and practices that you thought of. Where are they found? What supports their power? And how can they be changed? I encourage you to take some time to reflect on those questions a little more. Where do we find these policies and practices, and what is it that supports their power? And how do you go about changing doctrines and policies and practices in the places that you find yourselves? And then I'd invite you to consider these kinds of questions. The first question is connected to this quote that you would have seen earlier. We began our study with this. Racism practiced by the white-skinned against their darker-skinned brothers is one of the world's basic problems and a blatant denial of the Christian faith. This came from the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada in 1972. I wonder, how did reading these words from 1972, how did they make you feel? And think about those feelings and think about why they made you feel the way you did when you read them. And then think about this question. What are some of the ways you see racism operating around you today? Where do you see it happening in school or at work? Where do you see it with law enforcement or in the court system? And what are some of the ways that you personally could address them in your life and in the places that you occupy? And finally, I'd invite you to consider this quote from Living Faith that I'll show on the screen in a moment. What do you think it means in your context when it says to each of us that justice demands the exercise of power for good? Think about this quote. Justice opposes prejudice in every form. It rejects discrimination on such grounds as race and sex, age, status, or handicap. Justice stands with our neighbors in the struggle for dignity and respect and demands the exercise of power for good from our subordinate standard Living Faith. So what do you think it means in your context when it says to each of us that justice demands the exercise of power for good? Now, when you see the next episode, our last episode, we'll be closing with some prayer and offering a list of a few resources as well to consider. But that's it for today, our part 4 in our study of 5 episodes. Again, I thank you for joining me and joining me on this journey. I would encourage you to check out the video recommendations at the end of this episode and also noted in the description. The one that you can click on at the end of the video is a short featuring Robyn Maynard talking about her book, Policing Black Lives. And then in the description, I've included a link to a panel discussion hosted by Desmond Cole, another recommendation I made at a previous episode, with a collection of Black authors. This was done for Maclean's magazine and recorded in June 2020 of this year. If you'd like to go just a little deeper in learning and hearing the experiences of Black authors and some of the research and studies that they have also done. And as always, please subscribe to our channel, our YouTube channel, to keep up to date when new episodes are posted. Thank you so much for staying engaged in this conversation today. And I'll see you again for our 5th and final episode of Speaking Out Against Racism and Hate in Canada. Thank you for joining us today.